Imagine an army of slaves who become the masters, soldiers who literally choose who gets to be king. They were, for a time, the most feared fighting force in the world, and they became the biggest threat to the very empire they helped build. This right here is the wild story of the Ottoman Janissaries.
So, take a look at these guys. This is what power looked like in the Ottoman Empire for centuries. These were the absolute elite, the Sultan's personal troops and the shock troops that pushed the empire's borders further and further out. And that really brings us to the central, kind of crazy question we're going to dig into. How on earth did this happen? How did a tool designed for absolute power end up turning on its own creator? It's an amazing story of loyalty, rebellion, and, what happens when power goes unchecked. To really get how they fell, we have to go right back to the beginning, because their origin is completely unique. They were, from day one, the Sultan's slave soldiers. The name itself, Janissary, new soldier, tells you so much, right? This was a revolutionary idea. Think about it. At a time when Europe was still messing around with feudal knights and unreliable mercenaries, the Ottomans created the first professional, paid, full-time army since the Roman Empire. They were way ahead of the curve.
So, how do you create these fiercely loyal new soldiers? Well, the answer is through a system that was both brilliant and absolutely brutal. It was called the devşirme.
Yeah, just let that sink in for a second. Tribute in blood. This was not a volunteer force. This was essentially a human tax. Christian families living under Ottoman rule had to give up their sons to serve the state. It's chilling.
In this process, wow, it was a complete remaking of a human being. A boy's family, his religion, his language, his entire identity. All of it was systematically erased and then replaced. He was rebuilt from the ground up with only one purpose and one loyalty, the Sultan.
In this image, it really gives you a sense of how organized this all was. You see the officials, the books, the kids all lined up. This wasn't random. It was a cold, efficient, bureaucratic system of enslavement, all designed to churn out the perfect, loyal soldier.
And you know what? For hundreds of years, the system worked terrifyingly well. It created a military force that was, for all intents and purposes, unstoppable.
Their advantage was just total. They got firearms way before anyone else in Europe, which was a huge deal. They were fanatically loyal, they were forbidden to marry, and they lived and died together. They even had this thing called the Brotherhood of the Spoon, since they all ate from the same pot. It created a bond, a unit cohesion that other armies just couldn't match.
And you can see just how crucial they became when you look at the numbers. I mean, they start out as this tiny group of less than 1,000 guys, and by the end of the 1600s, there are almost 70,000 of them. The bigger the empire got, the more it needed its elite corps. And man, did they deliver. These aren't just random battles. These are the turning points that defined the Ottoman Empire. The Janissaries were the ones who finally broke through the walls of Constantinople. They crushed the Hungarian army at Mohacs. They built the empire, literally, with their own blood and gunpowder.
Okay, but this is where the story takes a major turn. Because the very thing that made them so essential, their strength and unity, is also what made them so dangerous. We're now entering the era of power, corruption, and full-blown rebellion.
This slide basically tells the whole story of their decay. Everything that made the early Janissaries so formidable just vanished. The celibate slave soldiers became a privileged class of guys who could marry, own businesses, and get their own kids into the corps without the tough training. And here's the absolute key. They went from protecting the throne to choosing who sat on it. And you can see it happen step by step on this timeline. It starts small, demanding more pay. Then a huge rule gets broken. They're allowed to marry. And then the point of no return. In 1622, they murder their own sultan just because he tried to reform them. They'd become a law unto themselves, a state within a state.
So you can see the transformation right here. On one side, you've got the empire builders, the disciplined, unstoppable force that conquered cities. And on the other, the empire breakers. They became a political machine, more interested in their own power and wealth than in fighting for the Sultan.
And this quote just nails it, doesn't it? Their greed and indiscipline. It wasn't just a political problem. It meant they were actually becoming bad soldiers. They were resisting any kind of modernization and were basically just a huge, expensive drain on the empire. So something had to give. The empire just couldn't survive with this cancer growing inside it.
And that brings us to the final, incredibly violent showdown, an event with the grimly ironic name of the Auspicious Incident.
First, just get a load of this number. By 1826, this is how many men were on the Janissary payroll: 135,000. And here's the kicker. Many of them weren't even real soldiers anymore. They were just names on a list collecting a paycheck. The whole thing had become a massive, unsustainable racket.
So along comes Sultan Mahmud II, and this guy, he's different. He's smart. He knows he can't just take them on directly. That's what got his ancestor killed. So he plays the long game. For years, he quietly builds his own power base while secretly creating a new, modern army to replace them.
Finally, Mahmud makes his move. He announces the formation of this new army. And, just like he knew they would, the Janissaries revolt. They start marching on the palace, just like they'd done a dozen times before. But this time was different. They were walking straight into a trap.
The Sultan's brand new, loyal artillery corps was waiting. They unleashed hell, firing cannons directly into the Janissary barracks. In the bombardment, more than 4,000 Janissaries were killed. The rebellion was literally blown to pieces.
And the end was swift and total. The survivors were hunted down and executed. Their property was seized. Their very name was erased from the books. After almost 500 years, one of the most famous military forces in history was completely annihilated in a single day.
So, we end up right back where we started, with this incredible paradox. A tool of power that got so powerful, it devoured its own master. Their story is a pretty stark lesson from history, and it leaves you with the big question, doesn't it? What happens when any institution gets too powerful, too set in its ways, and refuses to change? Is it just doomed to destroy itself?